just going to give it another minute or two for everybody to join in, although we see that there's already quite a few people trickling in already. So we'll get started here shortly. And while we're waiting, if I can just do a quick, if you can post something in the Q&A or raise your hand or something to indicate that you can hear me, that would be great. Okay, I see a lot of raised hands, so that's good. All right, looks like we've got a good sized group here today. So we're gonna go ahead and get started, but we'll probably have people joining as they go. It looks like, yep, a couple more joined just as I said that sentence. Okay, so we're gonna get started here. My name is Chintan Sutaria and I'm the president of CalcuQuote. If you haven't attended one of these webinars before, the purpose of these webinars is to just provide general education for the industry related to EMS specifically. The purpose of today's webinar is to talk about Microsoft Excel because that is one of the most ubiquitous tools used in this industry by everybody from the CEO to the buyer to even the production floor. Just many people throughout any EMS company are using Microsoft Excel, and we're going to be talking about Excel in the context of various real case scenarios that you may encounter in your day-to-day job. The point of it, though, is not just to focus on the context, it's also to just understand the principles of Microsoft Excel. So we're going to go through that. A quick introduction about myself. As I mentioned, my name is Chintan Sutaria. I'm the president of CalcuQuote. With Microsoft Excel, I have a very love-hate relationship. So I started using Microsoft Excel probably when I was in middle school or high school. It's evolved a lot since then, and it constantly continues to get better. So I always jokingly say that Microsoft Excel can do pretty much anything you ever wanted it to do in terms of data handling, and even more than that. Actually, there's you can get video games in Excel and things like that. It gets pretty creative. So I've been working with Excel for many years, both through the lens of my experience in contract manufacturing, as well as in consulting, as well as just being interested in how the product works. So that's where I compiled these tricks from, partly from my own experience and partly from questions that we typically get from contract manufacturers. So as some of you may be aware, CalcuQuote is an online quoting tool. We help with the entire RFQ process, beginning to end, from when a customer requests a quote from you to being able to send a finished quote with materials, labor, overhead, markup, all of that considered. So through that, through our support channels there, we hear from customers all the time about the types of bombs they get from their customers and how messy they are, the types of analytics they're trying to do on their process metrics and things like that. What's my turn time? And then also trying to decipher, how to work with formulas and cut and paste, and all the way down to like the most basic functions of Excel up to the most complex functions of Excel. So that's the context of today. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen here, and I'm on a title page here, but the way we're going to do the webinar today is very different from the way we've done them in the past. So there's no PowerPoint slides today. Really, it's going to be a very interactive session. And so, as we go through it, I'm going to be working with a real live Excel document and doing things live for you. As we go through it, you're going to see me, using Microsoft Excel. If you could please use the question and answer to indicate if you have further detailed questions about how to handle something. I'd be happy to address those. This is going to be a much more interactive type webinar than we've done in the past. So feel free to ask questions as we go through it. And we're going to just get started here. So as I laid out earlier, we're going to be working through some live examples. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with handling a bill of material. And so I'm going to click on this tab down here at the bottom, and the BOM tab here, I've just put in a very simple bill of material to get us started. And to start off with, we're going to start at the easier end of the spectrum and work our way forwards from there. So I've got the bill of material open here. And I'm just going to go through a few things that you may want to do with a BOM as you get it, right? So again, this is a simplified example for our purposes today, but obviously I understand that typically BOMs are not just 6 line items. They're usually much larger than that. So keep that in mind. So the first thing I want to do is I've got a bill of material. It might be several hundred line items long. And when I'm scrolling through it, I hate that I can't see the header. I forget which column is which, right? And if I go to the right, same thing, the columns disappear. So the first thing I want to show you is how to freeze the frames so those stay in view, right? And I should qualify this by saying that I'm working on an Apple computer. Your version of Excel may look slightly different than this, but the principles still apply. Most of the buttons are still more or less in the same place. And if you can't find the button for some reason, Google's a great resource to help you figure out where to find the same functions that I'm going to show you. There's nothing that I'm going to show you today that would not be available on PC or Mac. It doesn't matter. So I want to show the top level column over here. I'm going to click on the view button. When I go to the view button, you can see there's a section over here that says window. And what I want to do is I want to freeze the top row. And when I do that, you see it created a slightly heavier weighted line over here. And now when I scroll down, that top heading stays in place. And I could do the same thing with freezing the first column. And so now when I scroll left or right, my line item stays in the same place. Now that's great and all, but I don't want to keep just the top column. I want to keep the MPN and the quantity headings in view as well. And I want to always have my MPN showing. And so in order to be able to do that, I'm going to unfreeze the panes and I'm going to position my cell to be right here. And what I'm interested in is anything to the left or to the top of this is what I want frozen. And the way I do that is I just now, after clicking that, instead of clicking freeze top row or freeze first column, I'm going to say freeze panes. When I do that, now you can see that both of those are frozen as well as this. Now, one thing to warn you about on this, it's that as you're going through and you try to do this, if I had positioned it down here, then most of my screen would be taken up, right? So if I freeze it down here, most of my screen gets taken up by what's frozen, which, if you're working with a pretty small screen, that can be kind of a pain to work with that way. So just keep that in mind. Don't try to freeze too many columns or too many rows because then you're giving up screen real estate for it. Okay, so now that I've frozen the rows and columns that I want, the next thing I want to do is I've got a bill of material here. I just want it to highlight for me where I have do not install parts. So I know I can see that here. This is a small BOM, but maybe I want to make it a little bit more visual. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this entire range of data right here. And I'm going to go back to my home tab and I'm going to apply conditional formatting. Those of you who aren't familiar with conditional formatting is used to give some sort of logic to change the formatting of a cell. And when I say formatting, I mean it could be changing the colors, it could be changing the font, it could be changing the outlines, it could be a variety of things. So I want to, in this case, I want to highlight anywhere where my quantity is equal to 0. And so I've selected this range of cells. I'm going to go to conditional formatting, highlight cell rules, I'm going to say equal to, and I want to highlight it in red. Actually, I'm going to highlight it in yellow. So I want to highlight it in yellow wherever my cell value is equal to 0. Now I'm going to click OK. And you can see right here that I've got yellow highlighting wherever it says 0. And if I had put 0 anywhere else, it would automatically highlight that as well. Okay. If there's any questions about this, feel free to ask. Like I said in the beginning, feel free to ask as we're going through it. We're going to make this interactive. If anybody does have questions, I'm happy to address them as we go. Okay, so I've got my 0 highlighted. Now I'm going to add an additional column over here. So let me do that. Give me 1 second here. I want to put in prices. So I'm going to bring across some information over here. I'm going to put in the unit price of each of these components. So I've got my unit price showing over here. And I'm going to format this to look like dollars instead of just decimals. So I'm going to say dollars right here. And that just makes it into a format that's recognizable as a currency. Once I've gotten this, I've got my column there. I'm going to apply some some formatting here as well. So I'm going to use this cell, and I want this over here in D2 to look just like this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say Format Painter, and I click over here. And now it's taken on the same formatting as the cell to the left of it. And I could do the same thing up here. So I want to keep this blue header all the way across. And so I've just done that. Okay, now that I've got my currency values in here for the unit price, I want to highlight which ones are the most expensive and which ones are the cheapest. So I'm going to go back to my conditional formatting, and I'm going to use a gradient here. So I've got color scales right here, and I can use any of these options to say which one is the highest value versus the lowest value. And you can tell how the coloring is going to happen because the top of the scale right here, so it's reddish at the top and greenish at the bottom, means the larger the value, the more red it's going to be, and the smaller the value, the more green it's going to be. If I chose this one, it would be the inverse of that. So I want to highlight the more expensive parts to be red, and so I click on that, and you can see now, as I've applied it, I've got red shading on the higher value parts and green shading on the lower value parts and yellowish in the middle. Okay, so that's how you apply a gradient. I'm going to show you one more example of this. So let's just say I want to now do, I'm going to add an additional column over here on the right. So I'm going to call this one, we're going to call this assembly cost. So assembly cost over here. And you can see it automatically picked up the formatting of the left side here. So I didn't have to do that format painter on that one. I will do it on this one though. So I've got my assembly price, and what I want to do here is figure out, this is my unit price, it's the price of one component, but I want to figure out what is the price for the assembly. And so to do that, I want to multiply this value by this value. And the way I can do that is I just put in an equal sign, and I just select the first cell and multiply it by the second cell. And as soon as I do that, you can see it just did 1 times 99 cents equals 99 cents. But I don't want to go through and do each one of these like that. So I don't want to go through and do the next one like this. So instead what I could do is I could just take this and I could drag it down. So if you hover over the bottom right of your cell, you can see a little square right there. And when you put your mouse right there, the icon changes color, it turns into a black crosshair, and you can just drag that down. And now you can see it's applied that formula all the way across. And if I wanted to see what's going into this formula, I could also double click on it, and it highlights the cells for me which are being drawn from. Or I could go into my formulas tab over here, and I could say trace my precedence. And when I do that, it'll tell me, oh, here's an arrow indicating where these values are coming from. Okay. So it's a good way to track your formulas. So now I've got my assembly cost here, and I want to do one additional type of conditional formatting here. So I want to, now that I have my assembly cost, I want to be able to highlight what is the most expensive contributor to my BOM cost. And so it might not necessarily be the 99 cents. Like in this case, I've got 4 of this part and it's 95 cents, so it comes out to be more. So I want to highlight those types of things. And so I'm going to go back to conditional formatting, and instead of using a gradient, I'm going to put in a new rule here, and we're going to use an icon set. So I can define whatever icons I want over here. There's a bunch of different options, but I want to put it with my red being the worst and green being the best. So I clicked reverse icon order, and I can set up some parameters over here. So I want the top third, middle third, and bottom third to be chosen. Otherwise, I could do different numbers. I could do percentile, things like that. But when I do that, you can see now it highlighted this one as being my costliest component, whereas this 99 cents that I thought was the most costly, turns out it's not so much because it's just quantity 1 per board. Okay, so we've applied some conditional formatting on a variety of these cells, and again, I'm showing you kind of the level 2 examples here. You can get much more granular, much more detailed with this. This is just to get you started with it. As you get into conditional formatting, you'll find that you can make conditional formatting dependent on other things. So for example, let me just show you one slight example of a higher level use of conditional formatting. So I could highlight this, and I could say conditional formatting, cell is equal to, and instead of putting in a value over here and hard coding that, I'm just going to say cell is equal to whatever I put into cell C13, and it's going to highlight that red. And now, wherever if I type in 1, it'll highlight everything that's a 1. If I type in a 2, it'll highlight everything that's a 2, and so on. Okay. Now let's move forward. Next thing I want to talk about is just a shortcut that will allow us to type into multiple cells at once. And so I'm going to go over here and I'm going to call this field to the right of the assembly cost. I'm going to call this part classification. Okay. And now I want to classify these parts based on, based on some internal structure. I'm going to to keep it simple, I'm going to call these parts A, B, or C. So I'm going to say I want my most expensive parts to be part class A. So I'm going to call this one class A. And then I want my medium ones, so I'll call these yellow ones right here, I'm going to make those class B. So I could type in class B and class B, but if I had a bunch of these to do, I don't want to go into each cell and type that in. I could also copy and paste using Control-C and Control-V as keyboard shortcuts. But again, I don't want to go through and do it that way. So what you could do is you could go through and hold down the Control key if you're using Windows or the Command key if you're using Mac. And you could go through and select all the places where you want to type something in. And once you've selected all of those places, you type something in. So I'm going to say part, this is class C, and then just push Control Enter or Command Enter. When you do that, it populates that everywhere. So that's a way to get entries into multiple cells at once, so that you don't have to type everything over and over again. So that, again, that was Control-C or Command-C to get it into multiple cells at once after you highlight it. Okay. Now we're going to go further to the right, and I want to create some columns over here. So I'm going to call this quantity 1 extended dollars, quantity 2 extended dollars, and quantity 3 extended dollars. And this is going to be for 10, 50, and 100. So what I want to do now is I want to calculate my extended cost for each of these line items at each of these quantities. Now, I could do that. So if I did this, I said this multiplied by this, right? So we learned the multiplication formula earlier. And if I do that, great. But if I start to copy this down, the problem is that the cells shift with it. So this one was correct, right? It was using this value and the 10. But when I go over here, it's using 990 and 124. I don't want it to do that. I still want it to reference G2, not G3. And the same thing applies if I go across. If I go to the right over here, then it says, oh, there's an error here because it's trying to multiply class C by 50, and that doesn't mean anything to anybody. And so what I'm going to do is let me clear out this stuff that I just created. What I want to do is I want to put in the formula, and I want to lock it in to say, don't move horizontally here and don't move vertically here. And so to do that, if I'm putting in E3 times G2, what I can do is I can say, I don't want the columns to shift in E3. And so I just put a $sign in front of it. That just locks it in place. That E should not change. The 3 can change, that's fine, but the E should not. And then same thing on the G2, I want the 2 to stay locked in, but the G can change. So if I scroll this formula across, it can go from G to H to I, and that's no problem, but I don't want it to go down. So once I do that, now I should be able to drag this down, and you can see that it kept everything in place. So the 10 is still there, but this moved down. So the $sign used in front of the column indicator or the row indicator can be a great tool to drag formulas across like this without having any issues created. Okay, and then I'm just gonna apply some formatting here again to make that look nice and clean. There we go. Okay, so now I've got my bill of material. It's very colorful. It's got the right formatting. It's got everything I want in it. The next step I have from here is I don't want to keep this file with all these formulas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of it. So I can push Control-A, and that selects everything. I'm going to copy it. And to get rid of all of these formulas, I'm just going to paste it. So I'm going to say paste special. So if I just did paste, it would just keep everything as is. I want to do paste special. I'm going to say paste values. And when I do that, it's going to remove all of my formulas and just put in the strict static value. So I'm going to say paste values. And now you can see over here, it just says 68 and 62. There's no formula reference in here. It's just the number. Okay, so that covers it for the bill of material tricks, bill of material related stuff. we're going to next move on to the quote log. So let's talk about the quote log here. Okay, this is a data set I just created. This is not real. The salespeople here are all working in at Dunder Mifflin. They're all characters from The Office, and the customer name and assembly name. All of these are just made up as well. I think it's mostly related to bikes. So yeah, this is a quote log. If your company is using a quote log, or if your company is using CalcuQuote, you're probably familiar with this concept. Basically, it is an entry for every quote that has been requested of the company, right? So it's got your salesperson name, the customer, the assembly number, when the RFQ was requested, when it's due back to the customer, when you actually sent it, if you won it or lost it, what the potential revenue was, and what the actual revenue was if you ended up winning it. So we're going to start off with this. And the first thing I want to do again on this one is I want to freeze the panes, just so when I scroll, I don't lose sight of that data, right? I don't want to be going and looking for which column I'm on or anything like that. So I'm going to just freeze the panes. I'm going to go to View, Freeze Panes, and now it makes it a little bit nicer, looks a little bit cleaner when I scroll in either direction. So that was the first step. The next thing I want to do is I want to know what is my average turn time on these quotes, right? So I've got the end date, I've got the due date, I've got the sent date. So I want to know what's the difference between my sent date and my RFQ end date. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go over here to the right. I'm going to just call this column, we're going to call this turn time. Okay. And the way I'm going to treat that is, so I've got my RFQ turn time column, and I'm just going to put in a formula. And so dates work just like arithmetic. So even though you're seeing 128.17 over here, if I were to format the cell just as a number, you would see an actual number in here. So it's 42,763. Excel basically stores these values as numbers and displays them as dates. So it's really just a change in how the cell is formatted. So it has a starting value, and then it just applies some addition on top of that to come up with a date, right? So with that, if I had put in, for example, if I had put in a 0, then it just says 1000, right? If I put in a 1, then it says 1100. So like that, I'm going to revert it back to what it was. Okay, so I've got my sent date over here. What I want to do is, because these are numbers behind the scenes that are just formatted, I could just do arithmetic and say this, subtract this. So I'm going to say equal sign this minus this. So that's my sent date minus my RFQ end date. When I push enter, it tells me what my value is, right? So I've got 6 over here. And again, I could drag this down and apply that as I go down. So it's giving me my RFQ turn time for each row over here. And also, because I'm adjacent to some cells here, I could just double click over here. So you see where my crosshairs have turned black. I could double click that, and it'll just take it all the way down to the bottom, wherever it finds a match. Okay. So I've got my RFQ turn time now. The next thing I want to do is I want to calculate whether I've been on time or not, right? So I've got my turn time here. The next thing I want to do is I want to say, well, what was the requested time? So I'm going to say requested turn time. I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to say RFQ due date this time minus the RFQ end date. And so now I can see that the requested turn time was 2 days, and I got it to him in 6 days. And same thing, if I double click on this, it'll show me everywhere where I got, what was the requested time. So like, here's a good example. They needed it in 10 days, but I gave it to them in 1 day. Okay, so I've got my requested turn time. I've got my actual turn time. And let me just relabel it. I'm going to call this actual turn time. Okay. The next thing I want to do is I want to see if I'm actually on time or not, right? So I've got my requested, I've got my actual. I want to know, was I on time? So this time we're going to use a conditional formula. There's a question in here. How do you account for weekend days if you don't want to count them? That's a great question. So this is a here. So let's try that, right? So I'm going to say business days, or we'll call it weekdays turn time. And the way you could do that is there's a formula in here for weekday, or I think it's work days maybe. Yeah, so you can put in net work days as a formula, and you just put in your start date and your end date. And you could specify an array of holidays. So if you wanted to exclude Thanksgiving and Christmas and things like that, you could do that kind of stuff as well. The formula you want is net work days. When you do that, now it's counted for somewhere between this date and this date, there was a Saturday or a Sunday. And so now it says it's actually 5 days, not 6 days. Let me know if that answered your question. But for our purposes today, I'm going to try to keep a simpler example, but that's your answer right there, is the network days. And I could apply the same thing all the way down here as well if I wanted to. So I could say, drop that down, and now I can see wherever there was network days. Let's see, we've got a couple here. Could you please show how you copy the formatting for the headers when you add columns? I missed what you showed. So to copy the formatting, so if I had typed in something over here, I'm just gonna type in test heading. Well, I've got this thing formatting. Let's try that down here, test heading. And it would apply the same way across, but I select this cell. I like the formatting in this cell. So I say, there's a button on the top left of your home tab. It's called Format Painter. So you just click on that, and then you click wherever you want that formatting to apply, and it'll format that. So we got these two things. What we were getting to is how to be able to tell if you are on time or not. And so I'm going to say on time ? And the way we're going to do this is we're going to put in a conditional formula. And so the way you put in a conditional formula is you say equal sign, and the formula you want to use here is if. And so if you put in if, then as you open the parenthesis, we've got a question here. Are we able to receive a copy of this spreadsheet so it can be used as a reference? Absolutely. You could use this spreadsheet, but there's also going to be a much more detailed, kind of broken out step-by-step version of the spreadsheet that you'll get after this as well for attending. And as always, it's available in our knowledge base, on CalcuQuote's knowledge base. So if you're a CalcuQuote customer, you'll also always have access to these types of resources. Okay, so we're back to where we were. So we're talking about on time. I'm putting in a formula here, and it's called a conditional formula or if formula. So I'm going to put in if equals if parenthesis. And then what it's asking for, you can see it's even guiding me about what I should do next. So it says, the first thing I want to know is what's my logical test. So the logical test is some sort of way to be able to figure out if some conditions are met, right? So in this case, I want to know if my requested turn time is greater than my actual turn time. And if that's the case, then there's a value if that's true, and there's a value if that's false, right? And so I'm going to say if my actual turn time, if my requested turn time is greater than my actual turn time, then I'm on time. So I'm going to write on time. Otherwise, I'm late. And once I put that formula in like that, again, just to recap, so the first thing was a logical test. It says if my requested time was greater than my actual time, then I'm on time, otherwise I'm late. When I put that in, this one says I'm late. But if I copy that down to the next one, it says that I'm on time. And like that, again, just like before, I could copy that all the way down, and now it's highlighted for me anywhere where I am on time or late. And again, now going back to our previous example of conditional formatting, I can go through here, I can highlight this whole column, and I could say conditional formatting, highlight cell rule equal to, I'm going to say if it says late, then highlight it red. And it's highlighted that red. And I could put in another one, I could say equal to on time, highlight it green. And there you go. Now I've got a very Christmassy looking on time field. Okay, so that's on time. Now we're going to get into some fun stuff here. So let me just clean this up a little bit. let's see. So we've got everything we need in terms of data here. We're going to get into some fun things now. We want to analyze this data set. So I want to know what is my percentage of on time versus late. And I want to know that by salesperson. Then I want to know that by customer. Then I want to know that by month. So I've got a bunch of different things I want to know. And the best way to do some kind of aggregated analysis on a quote log like this is to use pivot tables. So if you haven't ever played with pivot tables before, it's scarier than, it sounds scarier than it is, right? A lot of people say, oh, I don't know how to deal with pivot tables. I'm going to show you some really basic things you can do with pivot tables that I think will give you a starting point. So let's get started. I'm going to say insert, and there's a pivot table button here. And a couple things you can to make note of here is to be able to use pivot tables. The first thing is that your data set has to be in some sort of logical table format, right? So if I had gaps in this, that would be a problem, right? If I had columns without names to them, that would be a problem. So you want to make sure that it's in some sort of well-structured table format. It's okay to have some blanks in here like this. Those are just going to be defined as blank values, but you don't want to have breaks in your table, right? You also don't want to have a table like this and then have another heading down here and another heading down here. You want to make sure that it's flat like this. So then I click on the insert column. I can select my data set. And again, I could push Control A and it'll select everything. So that's another keyboard shortcut for you. And I'm just going to say pivot table. And it's asking me, okay, is this the range of the pivot table you want to work with? If I had, if I wanted to exclude certain columns, I could change this from N135 to K135 and it'll exclude these additional columns, but I want to keep those. And I'm going to put that in a new worksheet. Again, if I put it in an existing worksheet, I could just put it to the right over here, but I want to put that in a new worksheet. So I'm going to click OK. And there you go. It created sheet 1 down here for me, and I'm going to relabel that. To relabel it, you just double click it. I'm going to call this pivot of quote log. Okay. So now I've got my pivot table. Now, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense by itself. It says to build a report, choose fields from the pivot table field list, which is this section over here. And essentially what you're doing is you're just defining what you want the X and Y to be, right? So if I want, let's just say I want to see all of my customers in the rows. So I take the customer field and I put it into rows. And there you go. These are the customers that I have, right? And then I want to know how many quotes I've done. So by customer, so I'm going to say in the values, I want to put this, and there you go. Now it's showing me the count of the assembly numbers by customer. So my highest quote count came from this customer and this customer. And that's pretty easy to tell from having it in a pivot table. Okay. But what I wanted to know is quote by sales, for example. So what I could do now is I could remove customer, and instead I'm going to put in the salesperson. And there you go. Now I can see which salesperson has brought in the most quotes as well. Pam's been doing a good job here. Okay. So now I've got quotes by sales. That's great for me. But I want to get a little bit more nuanced than this, right? So I'm happy with this information. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you guys can see it a little bit clearer. I'm happy with this information, but I also want to know on-time performance by sales. So what I'm going to do is I want to create a column for how many quotes they had on time versus how many quotes they had late. Okay, so I want to split this number. So if it's 10 and a few of them were on time, a few of them were late, I want to create 2 columns for that. The way I do that is I'm going to go over here for on time, and I'm going to put that under columns. And as soon as I did that, you can see I've got late and on time. So Andy had 7 late and 3 on time, whereas somebody else might have had better performance over here. Okay, and looks like Creed's doing the best job here. Okay, but this gives me numbers. It doesn't give me percentages, and maybe I'm more interested in percentages instead of numbers. And so the way you could do that is you could right-click over here, and you could say, oh, sorry, I want to go over here. I'm going to click this eye icon over here, and instead of showing, it says summarize by count, I'm going to say show data as, and I'm going to put that as a percentage of row total. So I want to know, instead of showing 7 and 3, I want it to show 70 and 30%. So I'm going to say percentage of row total, I'm going to click OK. There you go. Now I've got it as 70%, 30%, and same thing all the way down. So now percent. And again, the same principles from before apply. So, oh, sorry, Creed's doing the worst because this is late and this is on time. I take back what I said before. Okay, so if I wanted to, I could now say, show me who has the most on-time quotes, and I could do conditional formatting, and I could say, apply some conditional formatting, and look, here's my all-star team right there for quote on-time performance. Okay, so I've got my on-time performance by sales. I'm going to do the same thing for, now I want to know wins by customer, right? So I'm going to say, let's get rid of this. So I want to replace salesperson with customer. So I'm going to say uncheck salesperson here. And you can see it still summed everything up. So I've got 50.75% on time. I'm going to drill that down. I'm going to do it by customer. And now I can see where my by customer what my on-time performance has been as well. And then instead of on time, I care about whether I'm winning or losing the business, right? So I'm going to say remove on time and instead put in status. And so I've got two statuses here, won and lost, and I can see what my win ratio is by customer as well. And if I wanted to change this, instead of saying count of is equal to a percentage of row total, I could change that as well. So I'm going to go to field settings again and say show data as no calculation. And I'm just going to keep that count right there. And there we go. Now, one other thing I want to show you is I want to see what was my revenue, right? So I want to see my potential revenue. And so instead of doing count of assemblies, I want to see what was I really winning and losing, right? Just winning or losing a quote by itself isn't as meaningful to me as winning and losing $1 million PO versus a $100 PO. So I'm going to say potential revenue I care about. I'm going to drag that down. And when I do that, now it's doing the sum of potential revenue, right? So now I can see what potential revenue I had. And again, I could format this. So I'm going to click over here and I'm going to click on number and I'm going to change that to currency. There we go. So now I've got where I'm winning and losing the most amount of business. So it looks like I lost a couple really large POs over here. And here, even though my quote quantities may have not been very favorable, it looks like I'm winning the business that counts. Okay. Finally, let's see. So the final thing I want to show you here is I want to drill down into this. So I want to see, okay, I got $117,000 over here, but which salesperson is really bringing in the money, right? So I want to drill down the out of the way hotels. I want to see which salespeople are calling on that account and how good they're doing. So what I can do is I can layer in my rows. So I'm going to still keep the customer in the rows column, and I'm going to add in salesperson below that. And now I can see it exploded out. So I've got my customer and underneath it, all of the salespeople that have called on that account and won or lost quotes. So if I go back to out of the way, it looks like most of the salespeople are doing pretty good on that one. Really, the only people that lost any business at all are these guys right here. Okay. And then finally, one of the things I want to show you is I'm going to collapse all of this stuff down. So let's go down here, collapsing it down. And now I want to filter based on salespeople, right? So I don't want to look at all the salespeople. That's too much information for me. I just want to do it by salesperson. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here, and there's something called a slicer, which is right here, insert slicer. So what I can do is I can say filter down based on some parameters. So I'm going to say salesperson. I'm going to click OK. And that gave me this list over here. And when I got this list, I can say, okay, show me by customer, win, loss, potential revenue for Creed. And that's filtered for Creed now, or show it for Dwight. And like that, I can go through, or if there was a team, then I could say multi-select by holding down the control key. So you can do it that way as well. So the slicer is a good way to dynamically be able to play with your data rather than having to go through and multiple clicks and filter and that kind of thing. Okay. Feel free to ask any questions again as we're going through it. Otherwise, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to talk about text-related formulas. Okay, so for the text-related formulas, we're going to start with a blank sheet here. And I've just got a couple examples that I want to show you. These are kind of some of the basic formula tricks based on how different part numbers come into bills of material. I know one of the most common things we hear from customers, I won't say one of the most common things, but one of the things that customers get most frustrated by is when the bill of material has part numbers layered in with other information in the same Excel cell, or they're split out for some reason or something like that. So we're going to just go through some easy ways to use formulas to handle that kind of stuff. So the first example we're going to use here is I'm going to put in part number over here. So I've got my part number split between two cells. If I wanted to combine this, how would I do that, right? So the way you can do that is there's two ways. You could just say this and this, and there you go. I've got my part number in one cell now. Or you could say there's a formula called concatenate. When you do that, you can say this and this, and you've got it combined again, right? So that's the first one, is if I had a part number split between two cells for whatever reason, or it doesn't have to be a part number, it could be anything, I could combine it using this concatenate formula. Okay, the next one is sometimes you get a part number and it's got a bunch of leading spaces or trailing spaces or something like that. So I'm gonna just type in, I'm gonna put in a bunch of spaces here, and I'm gonna put in part number and put in a bunch of trailing spaces. Oh, there we go, a bunch of trailing spaces. Okay, so I've got a bunch of spaces in the beginning and a bunch of spaces at the end, but I don't want to do that. I want to keep it all trim of the spaces. So exactly the word I just chose, you just type in equals trim, and that gives you a formula where you select the text, and there you go. Now it's taken out the leading and the trailing spaces. The same thing would happen if there was leading zeros or something like that. Okay, so that's the trim function. Now we're going to talk about a scenario where you've got the manufacturer like a prefix with the part number. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to type in MFGR part number, right? So I've got a 4-digit code or something like that prefixing all of my part numbers, and I want to get rid of that. Or actually, first I want to isolate that. So if there's a 4-digit prefix, I want to know what that is. So I'm going to say equals left. And when I do that, it just tells me, okay, again, it's guiding me. So it says, okay, what's the text that you're trying to get the left side of? So I'm going to say it's this one. And then how many characters do you want? I want the first 4 on the left-hand side. And when I do that, there you go. It's isolated for me, MFGR. And I could do the same thing. So I could do equals right if I had a suffix. So if I did right of this and 4, it would give me the right 4 characters. Okay. But sometimes I want everything except for the left 4 characters. So I've got the same thing over here, but I don't want the MFGR. I want the part number to be listed in this cell. And so this is going to be a combination of this plus this. So here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to do equals, equals left, equals right of this, and then for the number of characters that I want, because my part number length could vary, right? So it's the suffix, it's the prefix that I want to get rid of. So the prefix might be a fixed 4 characters, but the part number length could vary. So I don't have a way of saying how many characters it's going to be. What I can do is I can say it's the length of this entire string of text minus the first 4. So that's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to say length, which is len, of this minus 4. So it's a formula embedded within a formula. Again, we're getting a little bit more advanced as we go through these examples, but you're going to see when I push enter, I've got just part number remaining instead of MFGR part number. And if I had changed the length of this text, so if I put in something here, it'll take that into consideration. Okay. All right, so that is the left and right function. Now let's get into a little bit more advanced stuff continuing. So I've got a value over here, and it is it's manufacturer with a little symbol over here, part number. And I want to change what that symbol looks like. Let's see, I've got a message over here. There's also, yeah, somebody pointed out to me, I could also use the mid function. So I could say equals mid and do it the same way. So I could say, what's my starting number character and what's the number of characters I want there, right? So I could say this, 5, etc. Okay. So the example I was on here was using the tilde. So I've got manufacturer, tilde, part number, and I want to change that. I want it to look a little bit nicer because maybe this was exported out of some system. So I want to change that tilde to a something that's a little bit easier to read. And so the way I could do that is I could use a substitute formula. So I'm going to say equals substitute, and I'm going to use the text from over here. And it says, okay, what's the old text? I'm going to say it's this tilde. And then what's the new text? And I'm going to give it a new value. I'm going to say I want it to be just a vertical line. And when I do that, it replaces the tilde with this. Right? Okay, so I've got that. Now, the next question is, sometimes you get a part number like this, where it's manufacturer name, space, part number. Now, it could be one word over here, it could be 2 words. So let's say it's 2 words, right? So I could do the same thing that I just did. So I'm going to say, I'm going to use the substitute formula. So I'm going to say equals substitute, and this is my text. The old text is a space. The new text is we're going to call that a pipe. It's a vertical line. But I don't want it to do that every time it finds a space. I want it to do it the second instance of that. So that's what this instance number means. And because it's in because it's at the end here, I know that it's optional. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to say I want the second instance over here. And when I put that in, it'll leave the first space alone and only do it for the second one. Okay, continuing down. So we took care of the multiple spaces. Now let's talk about, this is probably one of the favorite ones that everybody gets. You get part numbers like this, right? So multiple part numbers with a line break in them so that they show all together next to each other. So to get into this one and how we're going to handle this, we're going to use the same formula we just had, but how do you represent a line break in a formula like this, right? You can't put in a line break. It's not a character or something like that. So the way you can handle that is there's something in Excel called a character formula. So I'm going to say char, and if I put in a 1 over here, it gives me some sort of value. If I put in a 2 over here, it gives me a different value. And like that, it could keep going, right? So I could put in char 15 and it'll have something. And each of these values represents something numerically, right? So I've got all these different characters being represented by this char formula. So this is something that you probably wouldn't know unless you Google searched it, but char 10 means line break. So what I could do here is I could say equals substitute and use this text, and the old text is going to be char 10, and the new text is going to be this pipe symbol. And now, there you go. Now I've got it broken up with a pipe instead of with a character break. And now I can actually very easily use text to columns. So I can say, go to over here, which actually, let me wait on that. I'm going to get into that later. But it's important to be able to change it from line breaks into some characters so that you can eventually use text to columns. Okay, so that's one way. Let's get into another thing. So sometimes you'll face this type of scenario as well. So I'm going to expand this out a little bit. So I've got manufacturer name, tilde, part number. And the way I want to handle that, same thing. I want to first be able to put all in one line, and then we're going to get into how to split that into text to columns. So I'm going to do the same thing, substitute, and actually I'm not even going to type that formula. I'm just going to use this one from up here, paste it in, and there we go. I've got it in. Okay, Now that we've got it in this format, what I want to do with this one and this one is I want to convert it from all being in one cell to being in two cells. So I'm going to highlight these two, and we use this text to columns. So I click on data, there's a button for text to columns, and what that does is I can specify where I want to split a cell. So I'm going to click on text to columns, and I'm going to do delimited. Fixed width would just mean I know exactly how many characters there are. We're going to use delimited. Click next, and I'm going to say use other, and my other is going to be this symbol right here, and that should, oh, maybe I need to, let me try this, otherwise I may have gotten, yeah, okay, sorry. So I need to first get rid of these formulas. I'm going to copy this, I'm going to paste special, put in values, and now I'm going to do text to columns. So I'm going to do text to columns, delimited, next, got the pipe symbol in here, and you can see it's showing me a preview down here. So it's got part number 1, part number 2, part number 3 in different columns. Click next, click finish. And there you go. I've got it in 3 different columns over here. And then if I wanted to, I could further split this out. So I could put this over here. And once I do that, I could also do this again for this column. So I'm going to do text to columns, delimited, and instead of using this pipe symbol, I've got a tilde over here. Click next, finish, and now I've got my part numbers separated from my manufacturer name when it started like this. Okay, that's it for the text-related tips. Obviously, there are more functions in Excel. There's no way we'd be able to cover them in the time allotted, but I'm going to open it up to some questions here if you have any. Otherwise, thank you all for attending, and we will be speaking again in approximately 1 month. We'll just give it a couple minutes here for questions to trickle in. And if, while I'm waiting for the questions, if you do have any feedback about how these webinars go for you, if you're finding value, or if there's a topic you'd like us to be able to cover, one of the nice things about the position we're in is we get to hear from EMS companies all across the United States, Canada, Europe, and now Australia. So it's really nice to be able to just hear different perspectives, what challenges people are facing, things like that. So definitely feel free to share feedback, ask questions, contact us. Our contact information is available on the website. Even if you don't want to talk about quoting, we're happy to talk about just general things to move the EMS industry forward. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in, so thank you all for attending and hope you have a great day. Oh, sorry, there is a question. Let's see. Are these the most commonly used formulas within supply chain? It's an interesting question. First of all, I'll start off by saying I don't have quantitative data to back up which formulas are being used most often, so I couldn't say that accurately to say these are the most commonly used formulas within supply chain. And the second thing is supply chain also is kind of a broad term. Supply chain within EMS, I'll say most people do use Microsoft Excel, but the spectrum of how advanced people's skills are is huge, right? So there's some people who aren't familiar with copy paste, and there's others who are writing macros and getting really advanced and programmatically doing a lot of things. So it really varies. I'll say if you were to ask me, the most commonly used formula in supply chain is probably sum, right? So I could do 1, 2, 3, and I want to sum this up. So I just do sum of 1, 2, and 3. That's, if I had to take an educated guess, that's probably the most commonly used one of anything, just because it's the simplest one, and you don't even have to have a formula put in for it. In fact, Excel gives you a button for it that does essentially the same thing. So there's a reason they put that shortcut there, because it's probably one of the more commonly used things. But related to the examples that I was talking about, I think these would represent good examples of the types of things that people struggle with. Any other questions? Okay, well, like I said, if you do have any questions following up from this webinar, you will get a recording of this as well as the files that we used. So we've got the files broken out into different tabs. Let me just show you a quick example here. So it's the same data set, it's just every function that I had done is broken out into different tabs over here to show you how I did it. So feel free to reference that as well. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of us. Thank you all very much for attending, and this concludes our webinar for today.